Amber Hughes grew up like anyone else. That is, until she came into contact with multiple entities and sightings that would simply defy any rational explanation. In today's video, I will be telling you the first half of Amber's story. Then, Amber herself will tell you about her encounter with a being she refers to as the Guardian. You won't want to miss this. This story was submitted to me by Amber, who detailed her terrifying experiences with the supernatural. Amber grew up in the San Juan Islands in the Pacific Northwest, specifically Orcas Island. As we all know, Washington State seems to be a hot spot for UFO encounters and all kinds of paranormal activity. As a kid, her family was the caretakers for a piece of property called Indian Point. It was a large farm, 152 acres relative to the whole island, 52 square miles. Now, the house she grew up in was an old farmhouse, which has since been torn down. The property secluded, and her nearest neighbors were a mile or two away. The property had a pasture for cows and a couple of horses, acres upon acres of fields with grass and hay mixed in with an orchard of apples, plums, and apricots. And of course, being that it was in the PNW, for those of you who don't live there, it's the Pacific Northwest, massive trees outlining the fields. A patch of mammoth madrone trees was just down the hill from where the farmhouse was situated. Looking out her window, she could see a grassy downward sloped field about 2 football fields in length and a private cove with a beach and dock at the base of the field. The cove fed into West Sound. To say it was picturesque is an understatement. In the summer, the grass in the field would be tall, sometimes even taller than Amber, and she would sit on her bed at the window and watch the water, occasionally seeing a ferry boat go by as it made its way from the Orcas Island ferry landing to Friday Harbor. She would play in the fields or take her horse for a ride and pick fruit directly from the trees in the orchard. She would also lay in the soft grass on the lawn at night, staring up at the Milky Way, dreaming about exploring the stars. Star Trek was a very popular series at the time, and she was a fan. There was almost no light pollution on or near the farm, so the stars were incredibly bright. Now, this will become important later. It was a truly beautiful, almost magical place, and she always felt fortunate to have grown up there. Amber had no fear of the dark. She had no reason to be afraid. I mean, there were no predators on the island, so the most fearsome creatures on the islands were raccoons, so there was nothing to be afraid of. It was safe, quiet, secluded, and secure. And to help tell this part of the story, we have included an overhead map and marked important points that are essential to best explain this event because it does involve landmarks on the island, which wouldn't make any sort of sense to someone who is not familiar with the area. This part of the story is tough for Amber to share. Every time she thinks of it, it's as if she is transported back in time to that very night, the night her world changed and her sense of security crumbled. As mentioned before, the house was situated on top of a hill. The windows in her room faced west and south. This gave her a nearly panoramic view of West Sound and Turtleback Mountain. She could see all the way across the sound to Shaw Island, which was located directly south. Now, Turtleback Mountain, the first significant landmark, was to the east and slightly north, about 1.5 miles away as the crow flies. Located about 1 mile south and slightly to the west in West Sound is Four Winds Camp. This is another important landmark. On this particular night, Amber had a friend over at her house. For the sake of the story, we will call her April. The 2 girls were either about 9 or 10, and after a long day of playing and running around the farm, Amber and April settled in for the night. Amber was in her bed, and the bed faced the east, the windows directly in front of her and towards Turtleback Mountain. There was an additional window that faced south directly to her right. April was on the floor, and there was barely any moon this night, so it was quite dark. As she was lying in bed, she saw April on her knees. It looked as though she was praying. Now, curious, Amber asked her what she was doing. "Wishing on a star," she answered. Amber had never done this nor knew how to do it. She was only 10 or so at the time. Also, part of living on a farm on an island, the seclusion can have, as a byproduct, naivety. How do you do that? She asked April. April got excited to be able to share this and jumps up onto the bed with Amber. April said, I focus on a star, clasp my hands together, and close my eyes. Then I make a wish. In case you were wondering, April didn't use the word clasp. That's a bit advanced for 4th graders, but it best describes what she was showing Amber. Now, it was her turn for excitement. I want to try it, Amber exclaimed. So they did it. They both got on their knees, facing south towards the West Sound. Amber searched the sky to find the star she wanted to wish on, clasped her hands together, closed her eyes, and thought of her wish. She doesn't remember what she wished for, likely something generic, but after they had finished, Amber asked April, which star did you wish on? And April points and said that one. Amber obviously had no idea which one she pointed to, but to humor her, Amber said, oh, yeah, I see it. Which star did you wish on? April had asked. That one. Amber pointed to this really big star, low in the sky that looked like it was in the sky in the direction over Four Winds Camp. I don't think that's a star, April replied. Of course it is, isn't it? Amber started to question if it really was a star. I mean, it was stationary, bright, and in the sky. She had seen airplanes and helicopters, and she knew how they looked. There weren't any of the telltale signs, so she assumed it was just a really large star. April and Amber could not take their eyes off the light, and now they debated amongst themselves what it could be. April initially thought it was a plane, but Amber explained that there were no other flashing lights, plus it was not moving. Even if it was moving towards them, eventually, the size of the light would change. As they debated, the lights abruptly went out. April and Amber stopped dead mid-sentence because what they now saw permanently turned their world upside down. At first it was difficult to see, but then it began to move. The two girls can't form sentences or thoughts out of pure disbelief, and what they see is a disc, silver on the top, the bottom with an orange section in the middle. April finally asks, "What is that?" "It's a UFO," Amber had responded, and she could recognize it because her dad had become recently obsessed with UFOs and read every book he can get his hands on. So they were all over the house. Remember, this is a time before the internet. After adding the tidbit about her dad's books, Amber worried that it diminished the facts as if what she experienced wasn't real, because the idea would have previously been planted in her head. Hence, she somehow created the illusion of a UFO to cover for something else. She thinks this is what happened when she told her mom. However, let's put those thoughts to bed. In no way was her having seen books about UFOs lying around the house related to what had happened. Instead, exposure to the books allowed her to recognize what was happening and was the only reason she could identify and make sense of what she saw. Without that, she would have been as lost as April and possibly even more panicked than she already was. Now, the UFO was moving fast, and really fast, and at the same time, it looked as if it was gliding. There was, it's very strange to say, almost an elegance to its movement. There was no sound, and they couldn't hear anything. At the nearby pond, there are tree frogs and toads croaking out in the fields, crickets chirping, and there were times between the amphibians and insects that it was deafening loud, but tonight, nothing. Just silence. And the two girls watched as the craft approached, and it came directly over the property. The next thing that happened, which is something Amber had no explanation for. Even now, it makes no sense. Let's explain one more thing, which only adds to the strangeness of this whole event. Amber's brother, who also had a friend over, and as she found out later was also awake, was in the room next to hers to the north. Now his windows faced north and east, so he had the same view of Turtleback Mountain as hers. All of the bedrooms had unusually large windows, no doubt intentionally, as to have as many unobstructed views of the gorgeous views of the property as possible. There were also no window treatments, so nothing was really blocking their windows. Now for the strange part. As the craft passed over the property, her entire room lit up with a bright white light. And when I say lit up, I mean lit up entirely, completely, as though they had turned on 100 spotlights. Okay, that might be a bit of an over-exaggeration, but the attempt at describing what occurred is no less valid. The two girls were in shock. They could not understand why or how this was happening. They were simply too afraid to move, and there was no beam of light emanating from the craft, so how was the room lit up? Maybe the strangest thing about the light was there was no shadows. None. Not in the closet or anywhere. It should have been impossible when you look at the craft's position in relation to the room. There should have been shadows, but there weren't. It felt like it was only her room that was illuminated and not outside, but honestly, it was so bright in her room that she could not actually tell. Also, it should have been blinding to the girls, having this incredibly bright light surround them where just moments before they had only been in darkness. It didn't hurt their eyes though. Yes, it was bright, but bright from every direction as to not cast a shadow, but it did not hurt. They could see just fine. As instantaneously as the light appeared, it was gone. The craft also never slowed down or stopped. It continued on toward Turtleback Mountain. Now, for this craft to cover the distance from over Four Winds Camp to near her house to over Turtleback Mountain, it only took a matter of seconds. It was way too fast for any known aircraft of the early 1990s, especially to have no sound as it passed, not to mention the fact that her room lit up completely. As the crow flies, the distance to go directly from Four Winds Camp to Turtleback Mountain is about 2.5 miles, give or take. If you look at a map, her house wasn't in the direct flight path. The craft would have had to intentionally move in an arc to travel over the property. Once the craft reaches the peak of Turtleback Mountain, it stopped and hovered for a moment. Then, the bright light turned back on. April and Amber were flabbergasted and terrified, though Amber also felt a tiny ping of excitement because this was so strange. Still, they didn't know what to make of this, think, or even digest what was happening. They bolted for her dad's room, which was also right next to Amber's room to the west, so it made kind of a right triangle shape between her dad's room, her room, and her brother's room. Her dad's window faced south. She woke up her father and told him, Dad, April and I just saw a UFO, it's outside right now. And her dad barely wakes up and says something that turns her little morsel of excitement into terror. And he says there are UFOs outside all the time. The whisper of excitement turns to dread. And she leaves his room with April, and they return to her room, hoping the craft is gone so they can just go to bed and forget that it happened. They weren't so lucky. The light was still sitting over the mountain. It hadn't moved. Amber felt a bit of relief that at least it wasn't doing anything else that was strange, but she had really hoped it was gone. The girls watched the lights out of nervousness. They had just wanted to go away, or think they had an overactive imaginations, or maybe it was a dream. They thought there was no real way this was real. I mean, aliens and UFOs don't exist, right? Suddenly, the light turns off. April and Amber braced for what was next. Then, it traveled back along the same path in the opposite direction. This made no sense. What was it doing and why? As it passed over the property again, her room lit up. The girls felt helpless. They can only watch. Amber felt that hiding under the blanket wouldn't do any good to protect them from what was outside. They were now both overstimulated and overwhelmed. The craft then took its place over the camp, and the light turned back on. It was now exactly in its original position from when this whole thing started. The craft went from back and forth several times in the next hour. Each time the light would turn off, taking the exact same flight path and position over the camp or mountain, then turn the light back on. And each time it passed, her room would light up. And Amber finally couldn't stay awake any longer. She doesn't even know what time it was when it started, nor when she finally fell asleep from exhaustion. April told her the next morning that it made several more passes and then finally took off. It was like it was there and then disappeared within a blink of an eye. The following day, Amber had asked her brother if his room had lit up too, and he said no, why would it? She told him about the UFO, and he and his friends started to make fun of her. Amber wasn't much of an artist at the time, but the family had a paint/art program on their computer, so her brother asked her to show him what the UFO looked like. And she did the best rendition of the UFO that she could at the time, and when she showed him the picture, she was ridiculed and laughed at. So April and Amber never again talked about what had happened. They also went their separate ways after that. It was all too much for them to cope with. Now, years later, as teenagers, Amber ran into April and mentioned that night. April's eyes got huge, and Amber could tell that she was hit with a wave of pure terror and remembering. "We don't talk about that night," is all she said. And the whole situation has had a lasting and permanent effect on both girls. Amber, she became afraid of the dark. Anytime she is outside, and even sometimes while inside, she has this sense of being watched. It has never gone away, and she always feels like there is something or someone sitting over her shoulder watching everything she does. Sure, maybe it sounds like a case of chronic paranoia, which part of it probably is, but her sense of security and privacy were completely shattered that night. She doesn't think she is being watched because she is special or chosen. She just thinks it's because her entire world was simply thrown into question. Since then, she hasn't had any more UFO or alien encounters, and she definitely doesn't think she was taken. She still doesn't know what they were doing or what they were looking for, but any sense of security that she had was obliterated. Amber also isn't sure of the lasting effect that the event may have had on her or April. Her reaction at the mere mention of it made April think that there wasn't anything good for her either. Now, let's hear from Amber herself as she tells us the most frightening part of this entire story. Get ready.
All right, well, as you know, this is my second story, and I think one thing that should be included is ever since I had that experience with the UFO, I think it awakened something in me, because it was before that, most people as they walk through life, they don't notice things around them more than their immediate surroundings. They don't feel things deeply. They don't have a deep sense of empathy. And even as a child, I had a really deep sense of empathy, which is pretty unusual for somebody who had developed that as young as I did. Maybe it was working with animals like I did and riding horses, but where it all really started was with the UFO, because from that day forward, I always felt like I was being watched, and not in a paranoid sense. I just felt like there was always something, not somebody, but something aware of my presence. And I don't think that they really interfered with my life too much, even though I have had some very weird things happen. There was definitely a early development of, I guess you could say, your sixth sense from the time that the incident with the UFO happened. I don't know if it's because it just made me aware that, wow, there are really things out there that we have no idea that these things even exist, at least back then. I mean, back in the early 90s, yeah, people were talking about UFOs. There was a whole Roswell thing. But I lived on an island, and I was a child, so I was never exposed to those type of things. I was wondering if maybe something happened with my dad, because it was like, as I had written to you before, that it was like an overnight thing where suddenly our house became filled with these books about UFOs and aliens and everything like that. And now I saw them, but I never read them. So I don't feel like that had an impact and is why I saw these things. And my dad is never one to share information. He's always been very stoic and quiet, and he doesn't share anything with anybody ever. His reaction to me seeing a UFO was very underwhelmed and very underwhelming, I suppose. Which, if you don't have experience with something like that, I would think that even somebody like him would be surprised and go into protective dad mode. But no, he was just like, no, UFOs are out there all the time. That caught me off guard. So it was from that day forward that things really took a turn in my life. And as I've listened to the stories that you've shared of other people's encounters and things that have happened, I started to realize that I have had a lot more happen in my life than I had any idea. I had no idea that there was a possible encounter with, say, a Bigfoot while I was camping, and rocks were being thrown into a river, and you can tell the size of the rock by the impact that it makes. And these were definitely boulders. These were not just rocks. These were boulders that were being thrown. And I just thought it was some people messing around. I was a kid at the time. I didn't really know. And we did a lot of camping up in the Mount Baker area and down off of the Columbia River, a lot of camping off of the Columbia River. And so I would say that would be where the greatest majority of my encounters have been. But I've also had them when I was living in Montrose, Colorado, and I would go camping. Yes, I wish I could remember the reservoir that we would go camping at. But the same thing would happen. And I heard, rocks being thrown. And by no means do I feel like I'm being followed. I just think that because I have this acute awareness of my surroundings, that I just happen to be more likely to experience things. Okay, now to the meat and bones, now to the real story that we talked about, the one that I had written out. As I said, things started when I was young. I was, aware of surroundings. I could feel things. If somebody was sad, it deeply affected me because I fed off of their energy. I remember that there was this time that my cat was hurt and he had a puncture wound, and I couldn't even look at the wound because every time I did, I physically felt the pain from it. And so, that is how I'm able to feel the world around me, is definitely through that sense of empathy. And so this particular story starts when I was living in Colorado. I went to high school in Montrose. My grandmother had bought a piece of property outside of Cortez. Gorgeous piece of property. Oh my gosh. I have pictures of sunsets where the sky is just on fire. It's so beautiful. And of course, in the Southwest, the sky is just immense. And it's unlike anything I had ever seen. And, I loved getting up and having coffee, sitting on the porch and just overlooking the valley where you could see, farmland. You could see one of the small reservoirs. And one of the most amazing things about this piece of property is just its overall view. It's one of the few places, because of where it's situated, that you can see 3 major landmarks in the Cortez and New Mexico area. And yes, I could see all the way down into New Mexico, which is just how it just speaks volumes of the value of this property strictly for its view. You could see to the south, you would see Sleeping Ute. Moving west a little bit, you would see all the way down into New Mexico and see Shiprock. And then to the southwest is an absolutely gorgeous place called Mesa Verde, where, of course, the Pueblos lived and they had cliff dwellings. And one little thing to add to the story is I remember visiting Colorado when I was a child, because I am from Washington State. I'm born and raised, but I did spend a majority of my time, at least half of my life, living in the Colorado area. And we went there for a family reunion when I was about 12 years old. And one of the things that they explained is that the Pueblo have this belief that when you see ghosts, they're not ghosts. What you actually are seeing is a window or a tear or a portal basically into, they didn't call it like another dimension, but basically into the world where their ancestors now live. So basically it's a window between 2 realms. And so when you're able to see when they're able to see their ancestors, or if we see ghosts, the Pueblo believed that this was a thinning of that veil, that wall. And so it created that window. And I always took this to heart because I don't see ghosts. I don't see spirits, but I can feel them. I can feel presence of things around me that normal people don't. I'll be, walking along and all of a sudden, the hair on my arms and the back of my neck will raise up. And I just get the sense that there's something there. And this is exactly what happened at my grandmother's. So from the living room, if you head down the hallway, there's a room on the right, just a small room, and then a bathroom. And then at the very end, because this is just a single white trailer, is the basically the main guest bedroom. And there's a window in that hallway, just a single window that is between that first little bedroom and that bathroom. And then as you continue down, then you're in that guest bedroom. Now, in that guest bedroom, there are bay windows. I've always been scared of uncovered windows at night, not only because of a horrific nightmare that I had as a child, but also the experience with the UFOs kind of made me feel vulnerable. And so I didn't want to leave my windows uncovered because I felt like it was a way to kind of block myself from the outside world, protect myself from them, even though honestly, there's no protecting yourself from, such things as UFOs, because that's actually a silly thought in itself. During the daytime, I would roam all over this property. When you would go outside, now my grandmother forbade any kind of digging. Even if it's small holes, she wanted no digging on the property. The entire property was just completely covered in artifacts everywhere that you turned. And so on one part of the property, there was actually some rocks that were placed, possibly. Now, this is just a wild guess. I don't know. But the way that they were placed, they were either part of some structure or part of an altar or something. And I'm not going to say, oh, this was an Indian burial ground, because it wasn't. It was not a burial ground. There were too many artifacts there that were of use to say that this was a burial ground. This was a stopping point of their migration. It would be about a day's walk from Mesa Verde. And so that puts it, right in a good area. It would only be like a mile or so maybe from water at the most, because during this time there was the river that ran through that area. Kind of to back up a little bit as a side story, my family actually has a very rich history in this area of Colorado. My mom's side of the family were actually one of the original settlers in this particular area. In fact, our family's original piece of property is underwater in McPhee. And I remember my grandmother and my great aunt telling me stories about how they would go out exploring, and there was caves that are now underwater that were just full of artifacts as well. So this was definitely a very rich and used environment. And so where this piece of property was situated would definitely be, kind of an ideal place to stay. You're up on a bluff, and so you can see all the way down into the valley. And there's also, it flattens out behind the property. And so where it sits, it's the perfect area. Just down the hill, you can, have your encampment, your fires, your everything without being exposed. But then up on this bluff is the perfect point to watch the area around you to make sure that you don't have enemies sneaking up on you. And that's where the story really that's really a key point in this story, is the fact exactly where this house sits, because this is what caused the experience that became one of the most intense things that has ever happened to me in my life. As I stated before, this property is just, it's beautiful. There's artifacts everywhere. I could sit down and just in a 10 square foot area, spend all day just brushing dirt aside, not digging, but brushing dirt aside, and finding pieces of property, arrowheads, pieces of arrowheads, spears, pieces of spears, obsidian pieces that were used for carving, rocks that were used as grinding stones. And it was just, I loved it. But then nighttime would hit and the entire energy shifted. And it became so overwhelming to the point where I could not go outside. because everything in my body screamed that I was not safe, even though I was perfectly safe. I was out in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest neighbors are, a quarter of a mile away, or I guess they're a little bit closer now, but I mean, the nearest neighbors are not, they're far. I would have to yell in order for my neighbors to hear me. If you're just out on your deck talking, people aren't going to hear you. But there was just something about this. And when I was in high school and I first came to the property, I didn't know how to reconcile with myself what was actually going on. I didn't understand what was happening because this part of myself was still very underdeveloped. It was something that I was kind of in denial of. It was something that I didn't even know about it, honestly. This is not something that my family ever really talks about or cares about. My mom is a little bit on the religious side. She's not deeply religious, but she teeters on that edge. And so when I talk about things that are spiritual, she just blows it off. She just brushes it off. Oh, it's no big deal. My dad was a little bit more understanding. He always knew that I had a side of me that was a lot more sensitive, that I could feel things, and he encouraged me to develop them, but he, again, never really talked about anything, so I knew very little about him and his level of sensitivity or anything. To come back again to the main story, once night fell, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. I did not want to go outside. I would run to the car because you had to go out the front door, around the side of the trailer, up some stairs, and then out to the car. And of course, since we're out in the middle of nowhere, it is just dark. It is so dark. I hated having to go out and get stuff out of the car at night or do anything outside of the house at night. I wouldn't even go for a walk. I was terrified, but I didn't know why. And then as I would walk down the hall to that bedroom at the end, that window, there was something about that window, and I didn't know, no idea what it was. I had no idea why it was that every time I passed that window, I just got this sense of foreboding. I couldn't see it, but it could see me, and it's not because it was nighttime and you can see in windows better at night. It was that whatever is there didn't actually physically exist, and it knew that I was there, and it knew exactly what I was, at least in a sense, but I didn't know what it was at that time. And it took me until I was in college to realize what it actually was. That's when I realized that he was a spirit. Now, I don't know what tribe he was from. I don't know who he actually was, but I could tell that his lot in life, he was a warrior, and he was a protector, and he was a watcher. In fact, I had eventually given him the name the Watcher because he always stood in that spot all night long, never moved. Now, I couldn't feel him as much during the day, but I could feel him at night. I could feel his presence. I could feel his spirit. I thought he was alone. I thought he was lonely. And eventually I felt sadness for him because I thought that he was still watching and protecting over a tribe that was no longer there. One night I had just decided, you know what? I'm going to reach out to him. I'm going to let him know that his time on this earth is over and that his tribe has moved on and that it's okay for him to move on too. All I wanted to do was help. I didn't think for a second what the ramifications of doing this would be. It had never occurred to me what I was doing because of who I was going into his realm. What would happen? Never in a million years. A detail also, when I went to bed, it was clear as can be. All the stars were out. There wasn't a particularly bright moon that night. I don't remember it being bright out, but I remember the sky being clear. And this becomes an important detail later. When I decide to make contact with things outside of myself, the way I do it is I lay in bed. I go through this whole like self-relaxation technique. I've gone through hypnosis when I was younger. And so I use those techniques to kind of just bring myself into a state of like ultimate relaxation. And so it brings down those walls, it brings down those barriers so I can be more receptive to the things around me. And oh my God, it was probably one of the most terrifying things that has ever happened to me. Excuse me, it's really hard to talk about because I can even feel it to this day. And this happened well over 10 years ago. As soon as I made contact, I was just pulled through into their side of things, into their world. And the next thing I know, I am surrounded by fire. I am surrounded by this entire tribe. And he is standing there and stoic, and he is pissed. And the medicine woman, the chief, everybody there. And they are angry. They are furious. And the ramifications was, I'm a white person. And they were alive during a time where there was strife between the native tribes and white people. And so I was a very unwelcome presence in their world, very unwelcome. And they made it abundantly clear that I was not okay coming into their world and making contact with them. There again, I was surrounded by fire. There was thunder just running through the air, or like rumbling through the air. And there was lightning flashing all around. And there was, they were banging on drums. At that moment, I realized, oh my God, he was never alone. He was there protecting his tribe that is still there. They are still on that property. They are still there. And he was protecting him. That's why he's never left. I realized my mistake right then. And I apologized profusely. I told him, I am so sorry. I was trying to help. I was trying to tell him that he didn't have to be here anymore because he just seemed so alone. And I felt so horrible that he was just there. I had no idea that you were here. But then think back to the way it felt at night when I would go outside. And I just had this feeling that I was very unwelcome and that I should not be there. And now it clicked. It made sense. Oh, crap. This was a huge mistake. And the medicine woman came up and she looked me square in the eyes. And she says, you are not welcome in this world and you will never come back. And if you do, you will not return to your world. And with that, they hit the drums hard and I was launched back into this reality. I woke up and I was in a cold sweat and it was storming outside. And it's just like, where the hell did this storm come from? This was not there when I went to bed. And you can always tell when the storm is rolling in. There are signs. There was none. The storm came out of nowhere. The next morning, my stepdad had mentioned to me that he had never experienced that. He's from New Mexico. And so he grew up with these type of storms. He has never seen a storm this intense in his entire life. And I had no idea that the choice that I made would have ramifications that extended back into this physical world. He still stands there today. The Watcher is still there. And I don't acknowledge him. I don't look at him. I just let him be, because I have no doubt that if I were to ever attempt anything like that again, that they would make good on their warning. And they gave me a fair warning. Other times that I have tried to tell this story, I was always met with some sort of consequence after. And it would always happen when I was asleep. There would be nightmares, and it was a way for them to kind of remind me, oh yes, you may not be here anymore, but we are still making sure that you're making good on your promise. So not only did I not reach out to them ever again, I don't reach out to anything in the spirit world. So I'm pretty sure that their warning was to not only cross into their world again, but the spirit world in general. So I have left it alone. So yeah, that's my story. That's what happened. And I'm dripping sweat just even reliving this. So I really hope that this is a warning to everybody to not meddle with things that we have no purpose getting ourselves involved with, but also try to see what the consequences would be before making those decisions. Again, I didn't think about the effects of a white person confronting a native tribe, even with good in my heart. When I think back on the experiences and the massacres and the slaughters that they've had to undergo, I don't blame them one bit. So there's actually a part of the story that I had left out. I omitted it because it is really, really hard to talk about. Just, telling the story in general is difficult, but talking about this part is terrifying. When I was pulled into their world and I was given the warning to never do it again, they almost didn't let me leave. I was on my knees, begging for my life. I was crying. I had tears streaming down my face, even though I could feel the rain pelting against my skin, just coming down in sheets. I could still feel the warm tears running down my face, and I was telling them how sorry I was for intruding into their world, that I meant no harm, that I didn't want anything to bring the Watcher peace, because I honestly thought that he was alone, and I felt my heart was breaking for him. They almost didn't let me go. They almost kept me there. They were ready to tie me up and keep me there permanently into their world, which I don't even know what would have happened to my body in this world. I honestly don't. I don't know if I just would have been in a coma or if I would have actually died in my sleep that night, but I can tell you it was real and it was terrifying. And when they finally gave me that warning to never do this again, never intrude into their world, never speak basically to a single member of that tribe again, which I'm not talking about their tribe out here in the physical world. It was to never try to contact them again. I took it seriously and I was grateful, and I told them, thank you for letting me go, because it is honestly terrifying to think that somebody who is not of this world has the power and the ability to affect not only their world, but ours as well. And again, I don't know what would have happened to me that night. All I know is that I am so grateful that they let me come back, and I have not forgotten that for a single second.